Major funding for NOVA is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. Additional funding was provided by the Johnson & Johnson family of companies supplying healthcare products worldwide. And Allied Corporation, an advanced technology company proud to support outstanding science programming on public television.
These people are from northern Laos in Southeast Asia. They are members of a remote hill tribe called the Hmong. But they are not dancing in their native country. This is a refugee camp in Thailand. Many of these people have been driven from their homeland, and with them they bring stories of poisonous gases that have descended on their villages, killing thousands of people. Their lament is that they have been subjected to a terrible new weapon, a chemical weapon that has come to be known as yellow rain. The Hmong are at the center of an international controversy over the use of chemical weapons. Recent evidence suggests there may be natural explanations for the yellow rain, and that, curiously enough, Asian honeybees may play a part. Could these stories of chemical warfare be explained by natural events? And what role can scientific investigation play in unraveling the mystery of yellow rain? This is Ban Vinai refugee camp in Thailand, just over the border from Laos. It houses the largest population of Hmong in the world, more than 40,000 people. As early as 1975, the Hmong were besieging journalists and physicians with stories of chemical warfare. U.S. officials began compiling interviews with refugees on the question of yellow rain.
We came from Vietnam originally. Everybody died, and as for that chemical, it was black. It was sticky to the leaves, and they went red and black. Sometimes the country got very barren indeed. People would get very giddy, reeling about. And if you touched the leaves, you would have yellow and black pus. When you went home, you would bleed from the skin.
We used to live in Laos, and from there we fled to Thailand because we just wanted to come to find somewhere to survive. Because in 1982 and 1983, the Vietnamese came to shoot the medicine at us. Some of it was yellow, and some of it was red. We Hmong, living there, saw this and would fall down and become very ill.
In 1981, Richard Burt presented a summary of the State Department's findings to a congressional hearing.
These attacks were conducted by low, slow-flying aircraft, sometimes identified as an AN-2, a Soviet biplane used as a crop duster in the Soviet Union. The plane would release a cloud, often described as yellow, sometimes orange, red, or other tints. The cloud would descend upon a village or upon people in the neighboring rice paddies. The cloud seemed to be made of small particles which made sounds when falling on rooftops or vegetation, similar to that made by rain. It came to be called by its victims the yellow rain. For those directly exposed to this yellow rain, its effect was quick and dramatic. They would experience an early onset of violent itching, vomiting, dizziness, and distorted vision. Within a short time, they would vomit blood, tinged material, then large quantities of bright red blood. Within an hour, they would die.
At first, the government suspected that World War I chemical agents were in use, like nerve gas and mustard gas. The introduction of these chemical agents so horrified the world that in 1925, major nations joined together to sign the Geneva Protocol, a treaty intended to prevent the use of these weapons ever again. Although most world powers agreed to the treaty, the Congress did not actually ratify the agreement until 50 years later. In 1972, a second agreement, the Biological and Toxin Weapons Convention, prohibited the development, production, and storage of toxic weapons. This was considered to be a major accomplishment in banning the use of chemical weapons. The importance of our government's allegations of chemical weapons use is that they could lead to the disintegration of these treaty agreements that were intended to put an end to the threat of biological and chemical warfare forever. The information about the attacks was based on refugee reports, collected mainly at the Ban Vinai refugee camp. The attacks were said to have occurred in two separate areas of Southeast Asia, in the northern hills of Laos, where the Hmong lived, but also along the southern Thailand border, where resistance fighters still held territory inside Kampuchea, formerly called Cambodia. In addition to the refugee reports, the State Department claimed to have samples of deadly toxins on leaves and rocks from both attack areas. The samples were taken to the Army Chemical Systems Laboratory in Maryland. The lab tested initial samples for all known chemical warfare agents, such as nerve gases and riot control agents, but they drew a complete blank. It was feared that the Soviet Union had developed a new and more sophisticated chemical agent and were using it in Southeast Asia. U.S. officials formed a committee with members from the intelligence community and scientists from within the Department of Defense to look into the question of the unknown agent. And it was two Army scientists, Dr. Emery Sarver and Dr. Sharon Watson, who did some of the initial research. Dr. Watson suggested to the committee what the alleged agent might be.
We joined that committee in 1980 and began to look at the symptoms that were seen in the victims from Southeast Asia and found those symptoms to be quite similar to something that we had seen working in the laboratory, and that was the trichothecene mycotoxins, which are produced by Fusarium.
Fusarium is a fungus. It grows in soil and functions as a decomposer, breaking down organic matter. Certain strains of Fusarium can produce poisons called mycotoxins. Some mycotoxins produced by Fusarium are called trichothecenes. Many of the trichothecenes can be extremely lethal chemicals. Although there are many different kinds of trichothecenes, the Army scientists suspected the Soviets were using at least 3 as chemical agents, including nevalinol, which can produce severe skin lesions, deoxynevalinol, or what is known as vomitoxin, and T2. The most potent of the 3 toxins is known to cause hemorrhaging in laboratory animals. In large doses, these trichothecenes could explain the symptoms reported by the Hmong. Scientists have known about Fusarium and the toxins it produces for decades. In 1944, a massive outbreak of mycotoxin poisoning occurred around Orenburg in southern Russia. Thousands of people died from eating moldy cereals. U.S. officials speculated that the Soviets had turned these mycotoxins into weapons and were supplying them to the communist governments of Laos and Vietnam. Agricultural scientists have known about mycotoxins since the 1950s. The fungus Fusarium can grow in foodstuffs like wheat and corn when they are improperly stored, and can accidentally infect feed for livestock, causing them to become sick. The Army didn't have the equipment to analyze for trichothecenes, so they sent samples of the suspected chemical agent to a laboratory at the University of Minnesota, where they have studied trichothecenes and their effects in animals for almost 15 years. Dr. Chester Moroka, director of the lab, is a well-known scientist in the field of mycotoxicology.
Well, one of my colleagues in July of 1981 telephoned me and asked me if I were would be willing to analyze some leaf samples. And so I said I would, but I didn't understand why we should look for mycotoxins in leaf samples, because we normally don't. We normally find them in agricultural products like maize or some cereal grains. But he convinced me that there was a need for this, so we consented to do this and made the actual analyses in August and released them soon after that.
The initial sample Dr. Maroka analyzed was a leaf and stem from an attack site in Kampuchea. The first step was to separate the deposits on the leaf from the leaf itself. This is done chemically in what is called a cleanup procedure. The sample was so small that Dr. Maroka's lab had just one chance to analyze the material. The extract is placed into a syringe and injected into a gas chromatograph, where it is heated and then separated into individual components. A computer records the results. A mass spectrometer linked to the same computer helps to further analyze the material. The computer then searches through its storehouse of information to match the components of the sample with what are known distinguishing trademarks of a particular molecular makeup. Each substance has a kind of identifying fingerprint. In the first sample, Dr. Maroka found evidence of the potent toxin T2 and 2 other trichothecines. He considered this to be an unusual combination of toxins, and in levels higher than what would be found in nature.
The conclusions I drew were that it is highly unusual to find any toxin on leaf surfaces, much less T2, nivalenol, and deoxynivalenol. So I had no knowledge of where the leaves came from at that particular time, so I thought that perhaps my colleague had a new method of producing these toxins, which I was not privy to, so I consulted on that basis. But after learning more about the leaf samples, my conclusion was that the toxins had to be placed there somehow by the intervention of man and not through natural occurrence.
Are a mockery.
On the basis of Dr. Maroka's results with the sample, the Secretary of State went forward with public accusations against the Soviet Union.
We now have physical evidence from Southeast Asia, which has been analyzed and found to contain abnormally high levels of 3 potent mycotoxins, poisonous substances not indigenous to the region, which are highly toxic to man and to animals.
Dr. Maroka went on to analyze a water sample containing some debris collected at the same attack site as the first leaf and stem sample. It contained deoxynivalenol and a trace of yet another extremely potent toxin, DAS. In all, Dr. Maroka analyzed 6 environmental samples. 5 contained evidence of toxins. The largest amount of T2 toxin was found in a sample of yellow powder scraped off rocks at an attack area in Laos. 143 parts per million of T2. The highest concentration of T2 ever recorded in nature is about 70 parts per million. This sample, known as C-168, became the most publicized of all the samples.
Ever since the United States government began to voice its concerns over reports of chemical weapons use, critics have demanded that we produce the smoking gun. The testimony of victims, of witnesses, of refugee military officers who have engaged in chemical warfare activities, and the technical intelligence was not enough. Those who did not believe said they would not believe unless we produced a smoking gun. Physical proof. We now have that smoking gun.
A gas mask from Afghanistan was brought into the United States in late 1981. On the mask, Army scientists found evidence of mycotoxins and confirmed their findings with 2 outside labs. Earlier in the year, the U.S. government had requested the United Nations to look into the question of yellow rain. An investigating team of medical and technical experts went to Thailand. Although they were never allowed into the attack areas of Laos or Kampuchea, they did collect samples from refugees. Their report in 1981 stated they were unable to reach a final conclusion as to whether or not chemical warfare had been used. Then ABC News turned up a sample from Southeast Asia. The sample was analyzed by Dr. Joseph Rosen at Rutgers University. He found evidence of 3 trichothecines at what he considered to be be abnormally high levels. He also found evidence of a synthetic material, polyethylene glycol. The U.S. based its assertions of chemical warfare on three types of information. Physical evidence, 5 positive environmental samples analyzed by Dr. Maroka, plus the Afghanistan gas mask. Intelligence information, including reports that placed a high Soviet official at a chemical weapons site in Laos, but for the most part, the information remains classified. And refugee reports describing numerous chemical attacks accounting for thousands of deaths. By early 1982, the government felt it had an ironclad case for chemical warfare in Southeast Asia. Robert Dean of the State Department comments.
Physical samples, intelligence information, and refugee reports. This composite of evidence provided proof, irrefutable proof, in the mind of this administration that toxin weapons were in fact being used in the region. The question then became for us how best to treat the issue, how best to shape the United States' role in this issue on the world scene so as to bring an immediate stop to the use of these heinous weapons.
Newspaper headlines carried the message of chemical warfare. But in the text, a voice of caution emerged. Dr. Matthew Meselson, a biochemist at Harvard University, did not agree with the conclusions of the State Department. Dr. Meselson has been an advisor to various administrations on chemical and biological weapons for almost 20 years. He remains skeptical of the initial government findings.
The plain fact, if you try to look at this objectively, is that whereas Dr. Maroka found or reported toxins in all of the environmental samples he received alleged to be the agent and reported on 5 out of 5, the Army found toxin in none of the samples that it looked at, more than 80 such samples. The UN submitted samples to 3 different laboratories. It deliberately put T2 in some. It deliberately sent clean control samples to others. One lab reported finding T2 in everything, even the clean control samples. That's the problem of laboratory contamination. 2 labs reported they couldn't find any anywhere, even where it had been deliberately added. So I think that any chemist would have to say that the situation is unsatisfactory. We don't know who's right, we don't know who's wrong, but we know that the initial reports of mycotoxin cannot be taken at face value at this time.
Reports of chemical attacks persisted into 1982. U.S. Embassy officials in Bangkok, who had been assigned the responsibility of following up the reports, also began collecting blood and urine samples from people who claimed they had been gassed. Along the Thailand and Kampuchean border, resistance forces occupy villages and continue to oppose the communist government of Kampuchea. Ban Sanye is one of the main villages along this frontier. It was along this border that embassy officials concentrated their efforts to find direct links between yellow rain and its victims. There are almost 30,000 people here, living in a kind of no man's land, dependent on relief agencies for their survival. Soldiers with the Khmer People's National Liberation Front were present when, in January of 1984, a British television team visited the camp. Tension in Ban Sanye was running high. It was the dry season, and the annual Vietnamese offensive was long overdue. Every house had a crude bunker for when the shells came. Their fear was that the Vietnamese would blast them over the border into Thailand, forcing them to abandon their homes for good. The day the British news team visited, the offensive began. In the Thai Catholic hospital, they were patching up soldiers and civilians alike as the guns opened up a few miles away. In 1982, there was an alleged chemical attack on a camp like this one to the south. Dr. Stepborn remembers dealing with the victims.
In that first incident, I met over 30 patients I found in hospital in Sok Sang. Most of them coming with vomiting, diarrhea, bloody diarrhea, and hematuria. passing blood in urine, some with stomachache, some with headache or dizziness, unable to walk or to move about.
Many of the people remembered a shell landing on the village, a dense yellow cloud covering it. That's when they felt ill. The symptoms they described were attributed to poisoning by chemicals. But Southeast Asia is plagued by disease, and many of the diseases can produce similar symptoms. Cerebral malaria, for instance, can cause vomiting, headaches, unconsciousness, and death. Dengue fever can cause headaches, fevers, and vomiting. And hemorrhagic fever can cause bleeding from the skin, sores, and severe hemorrhaging, especially in children. 3 months later, there were reports of a second chemical attack, but this time only the children became ill. Dr. Stepborn thinks there was a medical explanation for this.
I personally most likely believe that it was due to the viral infection that mostly happened during these months of the year. That is the viral diarrhea, the epidemic of viral diarrhea in children.
In an attempt to sort out the obvious confusion between exposure to yellow rain and natural disease, the Thai doctors have been collecting blood, water, and environmental samples from attack sites for over 2 years. The U.S. Embassy team collected blood and urine samples from soldiers of the resistance forces that claimed to have been gassed. These samples were then sent on to the U.S. for analysis.
In 1982, we began a program to look at blood samples taken from victims and paired blood samples taken from controls who were living under the same conditions as the victims but did not claim to have been in an attack. We analyzed those samples for presence of T2 and its metabolites, the toxins that we suspected to be used in yellow rain. We found those toxins in 32% of the victims that we analyzed, and we found no toxins in any of the controls that we analyzed. We felt that this was very good evidence of the use of the trichothecenes in yellow rain.
From the analysis of almost 500 samples, a list of positive results in 18 were published. The rest remain classified. Most of the Kampuchean soldiers from whom blood was drawn reported they had been attacked days or even weeks previously. Yet research indicates that the main trichothecene, T2, would be flushed out of their bodies within a matter of hours. It's led to speculation that the fusarium toxins may indeed be present naturally in the environment. It has been known for at least 20 years that fusarium infects almost everything in the tropics, from pineapples to bananas and even melons. The U.S. government maintains that although certain strains of fusarium do occur naturally in Southeast Asia, they do not produce the kind of toxins or enough toxins to make people seriously ill. However, there has been some indication that fusarium grows in moldy foods and may indeed produce these particular trichothecene toxins. There was a study done in the early 70s to monitor a different fungus called Aspergillus, which produces a toxin called aflatoxin. The whole of Southeast Asia is rife with it. The fungus Aspergillus grows in a regional Thai dish called sticky rice. Hundreds of children have died, possibly from eating contaminated moldy foods. It's in all the peanuts, too. Aflatoxin should not be confused with trichothecene toxins, but in many places where the study found the fungus that produced aflatoxin, they found strains of fusarium growing too. Although the study did not analyze for the trichothecenes like T2, it did indicate the presence of fusarium in moldy foods, foods that were commonly consumed. Could this account for the finding of T2 in the blood samples? In March 1982, an autopsy was done on a resistance fighter who had died 5 weeks after a chemical attack. When the organs were analyzed, small amounts of the toxin T2 were found in his lungs and kidney, and much larger amounts in the stomach and intestine, indicating he may have swallowed the toxin. The government argued that the presence of the toxins was due to chemical poisoning. But there were also large amounts of aflatoxin in the liver, kidney, stomach, and intestine. Aflatoxin is a clear indicator that the victim did eat moldy food, and that might explain how T2 toxin got into his system as well. The trouble is, the science of toxicology is not an overwhelming priority here on the Kampuchean border. The work has simply not been done. Even if trichothecenes occur naturally in Southeast Asia, it still doesn't explain why so many of the Hmong refugees told stories of chemical attacks. This is Si Chiang Mai in northern Thailand. Hmong refugees were still streaming over the Mekong River early in 1984, bringing yellow rain stories with them. A British nurse, Andrea Crossland, has been looking after them for 2 years. She has spent much of her time listening to and recording their very traumatic stories.
Something is happening out there, and they associate the yellow, the blue, the green, the black spots that are coming down. They have seen the planes, they haven't seen the planes, they've heard the planes, they saw nothing, but something is definitely different, and they believe that it is coming from planes. Something is very wrong, and if it isn't mycotoxins, then it's certainly something that's very strong and very devastating. And why just Hmong?
The recent history of the Hmong in Southeast Asia illustrates why they may have been victims of attacks in their own country of Laos. In the 1950s and 60s, several different factions within the country battled it out for supremacy in a bitter civil war. It's well known that the Central Intelligence Agency was involved. The CIA had no faith in the faction called the Neutralists and didn't want Laos to fall into the hands of the Communists. So it recruited an army in the northern mountains and selected a Hmong military leader named Vang Pao to lead it. He established his base on the plain of Jars in northern Laos. His 50,000-strong army was totally supported through airlifts, carried out by the CIA's own airline, Air America. The Communists eventually won, and Laos lay in ruins. Vang Pao was forced to flee to Thailand and on to America. The Hmong community was in ruins too. The whole structure of their society had collapsed. Families and clans had become separated. CIA support had dried up. There was starvation and death. As the Hmong struggled south to the lowlands, they encountered diseases to which they had no immunity. Fearful of retaliation from the new Laotian government, the Hmong fled to Thailand, and only then did yellow rain stories begin to appear. The communist government of Laos has continually denied the use of chemical weapons against the Hmong people. They say that the Hmong tell these stories as a way to ingratiate themselves to American officials. Jackie Shagnon and Roger Rumpf have lived in Laos for several years and are members of the American Friends Service Committee. They speak the language and have a different interpretation of the refugee reports. They have been in the city of Ban Dun and the area of Muang Hum, where alleged chemical attacks took place. They returned to Laos a year ago, specifically to investigate the stories of yellow rain.
In every place that we have gone, there were Laotian officials who specifically talked about this. And as a matter of fact, very often they were the first to mention it. And they would associate it with death and disease as well. However, when we questioned, in one case, the medic of the region, of the district, the chief medic, about a particular incident in a lowland Lao village, he said, no, that wasn't due to any chemicals or chemical poisoning, that was due to cerebral malaria. I treated it, and we brought in several special doctors to help treat the malaria. Those who were treated in time lived. Those who were not treated in time did not live.
We've talked to both UN officials, we've talked to Lao doctors and medics about this, and they all confirm the same kind of information, that the problems of parasites, problems of mosquitoes, problems of people not boiling their water, not eating clean food, and having good sanitation practices create all kinds of major outbreaks of disease within the country.
Out of the unknown, one has to come up with an explanation. Always. We do it and they do it. And in a situation like Laos, where medical research and scientific information is extremely limited, you get more stories and fabrication than normally. And it is very hard then to test the stories out. And this is, in other words, a myth, the legend that comes out of storytelling in an oral society where books and radio and TV communications are limited.
Certain members of Congress were interested in the reports coming from Southeast Asia. In 1979, Congressman Jim Leach went there to personally investigate the stories by the refugees. He recounts his visit.
Well, first let me say I have visited northern Thailand. I've talked with refugees. When you have a father describe a son dying in his arms from yellow rain from an airplane he witnessed dropping from the sky, and you describe him, and you see him describing the convulsions, the nausea, the bleeding from the ears and the mouth and the nose, and then the death, you don't disbelieve. And when you have thousands of accounts of similar types of activities, it is nothing less than sophisticated, big world arrogance that thinks that you and I, because we have educations that allow us to read and write, can somehow know better about what's happening to our family than someone who can't.
The government has collected thousands of reports of chemical poisoning, accounting for thousands of deaths. About 200 summaries of the interviews have been released. Another 100 reports have come through independent sources. Dr. Matthew Meselson reviewed the summaries.
Altogether, there are about 300 English language summaries of refugee statements about chemical warfare. They span the gamut in terms of what they are describing. In fact, the only major consistency that I can see is that when they see the agent on the ground, it is yellow. But sometimes it is delivered by aircraft, sometimes by artillery shells, sometimes by rockets. Sometimes illness follows immediately, sometimes hours, sometimes days, sometimes weeks. It's very hard to filter out any very consistent picture from it, except that most of the reports claim that there was some kind of chemical attack and some kind of illness.
If some of the illnesses described by the Hmong could be explained by natural diseases, what might explain the material falling from the sky? One clue emerged when yellow rain fell on a village called Ban Sartong in Thailand, near the Kampuchean border.
นึกว่าฝนตกโอ้ยไม่ไงฝนตกสิเก็บผ้าสิไปโจมมะกล้วยแห้งก็บ่เอาบ่เห็นผลแล้วลงพื้นก็เลี้ยงแล้วขึ้นหลังคาเลี้ยงย่างไปเบิ่งห้องน้ำก็เลี้ยงเปิ้เห็นไหนบ้านแม่งเอ้ยเอาเบิ่งบ้านมาเบิ่งเฮียนบางซ่านข่อยได้เป็นหยังจังเลี้ยงไอ้ช่างเป็นเอาอันไหนลงท่านก็เอิ้นเรียกไม่ไงมาเบิ่งบ้านข่อยได้ฝนตกบ่แม่นฝนตกก็บ่แม่นเป็นหยังยังเป็นแป้นกระดานเลี้ยงจังซี่พ่อไม่ไงว่าใช่บ่แม่นกูบ่เคยเห็นไม่ไงตอบ
Her husband saw a plane.
ครั้งแรกผมเห็นมาด้านทิศตะวันออกแล้วนี่ก็วนกลับแล้วก็เครื่องบินนั้นเป็นเครื่องบินปีกชั้นเดียวแล้วก็เห็นในระยะในราวสักประมาณตัวขนาดนกอินทรีได้ขนาดโตของเครื่องบิน
Later estimates put the plane at 5,000 feet, yet most of the yellow spots fell over just 6 houses in the village. A health official explained that a few days later, the villagers started complaining of illness.
มีประเภทปวดหัวตัวร้อนนิดหน่อยธรรมดาคงไม่ใช่สาเหตุจากอันนี้ครับไม่มีจากนั้นก็มันก็มีคนใกล้เคียงฮะคงเป็นอาการของนิโรสิตขึ้นมากขึ้นเพราะมันกลัวอยู่แล้วนะแล้วครับธรรมดาบางคนปวดหัวบางคนใจสั่นอย่างนี้มันเป็นอาการทั่วไป
The health official wrote it off as a mild hysteria, But a few weeks later, 2 Canadian investigating teams visited the area. One team thought some of the symptoms were genuine and discovered a number of yellow rain showers in surrounding villages around the same date. They concluded that yellow rain had been used in a battle in Kampuchea and had drifted over the border on the wind. A Canadian toxicologist sampled the yellow spots and had them analyzed in Thailand. He and the Thai researchers discovered an extra and baffling ingredient of yellow rain: pollen. Dr. Bruno Schiefer, a toxicologist with the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, collected the samples and speculates why they contain pollen.
The possibilities are that the actual material that was sprayed was simply a sticky material without any pollen, and pollen then were wind blown and got stuck on that sticky material. Completely nothing to do with the yellow rain as such, if you want so. The second possibility is that the pollen was added, for either color identification or to give it some heavy weight or some texture. Yeah? The third possibility is that the pollen grain was actually used as a carrier of the toxin, that, so to speak, the toxin was poured onto the pollen to be used as a method of distribution.
At the Army's chemical laboratory, Dr. Emery Sarver also began analyzing the yellow spots and powder samples from Southeast Asia.
We started looking for pollen and were able to identify it in the sample, the C168, which has been probably the most publicized sample we've had. It was primarily pollen, and since then we have put that into our analytical scheme to look for pollen.
Initially, when we began to look more closely at the pollen, we found that it was of a particular particle size, and that particular particle size would be the ideal size for an agent that would be delivered by inhalation. So we said, well, maybe the theory of the 3 possibilities that it is part of a carrier system is a little bit stronger. We'll investigate that further.
In a State Department briefing of November 1982, pollen was suggested as a carrier for the toxins.
This didn't make much sense to me. I've been trying to learn as much as I can about chemical weapons for more than 20 years, and it didn't make any sense to me that there would be pollen in a chemical warfare agent. This made me very sure, in the sense that a scientist has a hunch that he hasn't yet proven, that the yellow rain was not a chemical warfare agent, but had some natural explanation, something in the world of nature.
Meselson contacted Peter Ashton, a colleague at Harvard and an expert on the botany of tropical rainforests, for advice.
Well, it was tantalizing, really, because on the one hand, several different studies had been made by experts from different countries, in point of fact, which had shown up on examination under the microscope that the spots on leaves and other surfaces called yellow rain consisted very largely of pollen grains. Unfortunately, the number of analyses in which these pollen grains were identified was very few, and in fact, only one, an Australian study, really provided any useful evidence in that respect.
1 month after the Canadian scientist had discovered the pollen, Dr. Hugh Crone at the Australian Defence Laboratory received a package of yellow rain samples from Thailand. They had been originally collected in Laos. The package consisted of 3 foil-wrapped packs and a bottle containing leaf fragments bearing yellow spots. Under the microscope, the yellow spots contained pollen grains belonging to a tropical shrub called rapenia. In the first pack, Dr. Crone found 30 cut portions of what looked like gum tree leaves. Many had 1 or 2 yellow spots on them. Pollen again, this time from the genus Harpullia, but no trace of toxins. Dr. Joan Nowicki, a pollen expert at the Smithsonian Institution, also examined some samples of yellow rain and discovered pollen associated with flowering plants in Southeast Asia.
Different spots had quite different pollen grains. Not only different pollen grains, but different numbers of pollen types, different kinds. And this suggested that it would be extremely difficult for them all to have come out of the same factory. On looking at the varieties which had been identified, one noticed that all these pollens are known to be collected by bees.
He contacted Tom Seeley, a tropical bee expert at Yale University.
The evidence that he gave to me was that these yellow spots, the yellow rain, were actually yellow spots, a few millimeters in diameter, spaced out several per square meter, and were largely composed of pollen. And he asked me if I could think of any way that bees would, anything about bee behavior or physiology which would lead one to expect such yellow spots. The characteristics he gave to me sounded just like the spots of feces produced by bees. To understand the defecation patterns of honeybees, you have to remember that they are social bees. They live in small cities, colonies. For all creatures that live together in societies, one of their paramount problems is keeping the group's area clean. So these bees cannot defecate just at any one time. Feces are accumulated in the bees, and periodically, at certain times, an individual will fly out and drop her load of feces. It's an appreciable load. It can accumulate to 30 or 40% of the volume of a bee's abdomen, forming a large-sized drop.
Going on the rather large size of the yellow spots, he singled out the biggest Asian honeybee, Apis dorsata, the probable culprit. Meselson decided to do an experiment. In March and April of 1983, he noticed that local honeybees conveniently left their droppings on windshields in the Harvard University parking lot. He collected them and discovered they contained pollen grains which the bees had eaten. He also found pollen in part of a yellow rain sample known as the ABC sample, in which Dr. Rosen had actually found trichothecenes. He turned up a bee hair among the pollen grains from Harvard, and in the ABC sample, a bee hair. He concluded that the samples of yellow rain were, in fact, the droppings of bees.
This left the question, do bees in huge numbers really make these showers? The refugees said that it comes down not one spot and then another, but in showers. And second, even if bees do that in Southeast Asia, wouldn't the people living there know what it was? How could they mistake it for a chemical warfare agent? The only way to answer those questions was to go.
In March of 1984, Dr. Meselson and Tom Seeley went to Thailand. They found large nests of the giant Asian honeybee, Apis dorsata. Vegetation nearby showed signs of bee droppings, and by placing large sheets of paper on the ground, they were able to tell how often the showers took place and the density of spots. In one case, they documented a single shower that covered thousands of square yards and dropped at least 100,000 yellow spots. Dr. Meselson then went to the Ban Vinai refugee camp with samples of the droppings. He showed 18 groups of refugees the yellow spots on the leaves and asked what the spots were. 13 groups said they didn't know. 4 of the groups said it was chemi, which is their word for chemical warfare. Only one person he interviewed indicated it was insect droppings.
We in Thailand accomplished what we wanted to do. We found out that these showers do happen, and we found out that in general, the Hmong people do not know what bee feces is when they see it, and that sometimes they even misidentify it, make a mistake, and say that it is a chemical weapon when it's really bee feces. We're convinced that the yellow rain, the yellow material that has been associated with these attacks for these many years, is the natural feces of Southeast Asian honeybees.
There is some supporting evidence for this theory. An obscure Chinese scientific paper was published in 1977, before the yellow rain allegations were underway. People in the central Chinese province of Jiangsu had been complaining in 1976 of glutinous yellow stuff coming from nowhere and covering up to several acres at a time. They christened it yellow rain. The Chinese scientists went to investigate. They discovered microorganisms and algae in it, and huge quantities of Chinese elm pollen. They concluded that the bees were eating the pollen and then evacuating over the village. The finding of pollen in the sample suggested something else to Dr. Watson.
When we began to look more closely at pollen, we found that there was not a firm association of pollen with the yellow rain attacks or with the trichothecenes, and we found pollen in only one sample. We found trichothecenes and pollen together in only one sample out of 12 that were examined. So that strengthened our feeling that the pollen was a collection artifact.
Government scientists contend that pollen is part of the collection process. The Hmong still associate yellow spots on the ground with death and disease. Resistance teams from the Ban Vinai camp continue to collect samples of the yellow rain in Laos. Van Geer is one of the Hmong leaders, and he claims that the yellow spots only fall during attacks and that the act of collecting them makes him ill. Bee feces are in no way toxic, but the fungus Fusarium could grow in the bee pollen once it landed, producing the toxins that make people ill. Could the toxins associated with illness actually grow in the bee feces? A possible link between pollen and the toxins came from the Mayadon University in Bangkok, where they analyzed some of those yellow spots from Ban Sartong, where the Canadians had collected samples containing pollen. They looked at the spots under the microscope and found pollen belonging to the dandelion family, Compositae, insect-pollinated plants which flower in Thailand at the beginning of the year. They also discovered fungi growing through the pollen strains, and one sample yielded a toxin-producing strain of Fusarium in the laboratory. But could this particular fungi produce the specific trichothecene toxins? The Canadian scientist Dr. Bruno Schiefer brought back different strains of Fusarium to investigate this question.
A number of the fungi that I brought back, would be classified as being potentially toxigenic strains. But from those that were tested, only one turned out to be a producer of toxins in very low quantities. And that was the only one that was found.
Schiefer concluded that this strain could not produce toxins in the natural environment. Other toxicologists suggest that they could, and more work needs to be done before final conclusions can be drawn. The State Department says that no toxins have been found in samples of yellow rain since March of 1983, but the reports of chemical attacks are still coming in. In February of 1984, there were reports of yellow rain atrocities in Laos in a village called Tam Dinh. Tam Dinh is a Hmong village. A British television team reported that it appeared rather peaceful for one that was supposedly decimated by chemical attack. While talking with a Hmong representative, they discovered that wild honey is considered a delicacy in this part of the world.
He's never had it fall on him, but does it fall on people? And what do they think when it falls on them? People who know about it.
ประชาชนอยู่บ้านนี้หรือว่าอยู่คงเขตนี้เห็นเกี่ยวกับอันนั้นท่านประชาชนเขาเจ้าคิดแนวใดเกี่ยวกับอันนั้น
นี่ประชาชนจำนวนหนึ่งที่มุทาหูก็คือเมื่อกี้เขาบอกเดเมื่อก่อนนี้ว่าปี70บอกหรือว่า69บอกว่านั้นแล้วมันอเมริกาแล้วมันทิ้งยามเบื่อตัวนี้แล้วมันสีเรื่องขึ้นในนี้มีสีเรื่องคือกันกับขี้ผึ้งนี่สีเรื่องคือในนี้แล้วมันเห็นตัวผึ้งเฮ็ดคือเป็นนี้แล้วมันว่าเพิ่นก็คือว่าแม่นไม่อยากอันใดอันนึงแต่ว่าตัวจริงพวกเฮามันเบิ่งตัวจริงไม่ตัวผึ้งนี่ไปมาๆคือ
Chemical warfare stories have been around since the early 1970s. The Hmong were traditional opium farmers, but the U.S. wanted to wipe out the narcotics trade.
There were allegations by Hmong leaders that in 1973, someone was spraying lethal clouds on their villages, killing many civilians, especially children. There was a program at that time to destroy the opium crops in order to limit the world supply of heroin, and herbicides were being sprayed. Quite possibly that's what they were referring to. These herbicides, so far as we know, are not lethal. Before that, of course, the United States made wide use of herbicides and riot control agents, both believed to be non-lethal, in South Vietnam. But the communist propaganda was that they both were lethal, and many people believed it inside Vietnam, especially Montagnard tribes people, who reported symptoms very much resembling those attributed to yellow rain: vomiting, diarrhea, coughing blood, skin irritation, skin rash, death of people, especially children.
The natural occurrence theories have emerged as alternative explanations of the events in Southeast Asia. The B theory may explain the yellow materials cited and collected as samples by the refugees. The theory that toxin-producing strains of Fusarium may occur naturally in the environment could account for why trichothekines were found in both environmental and blood samples. And diseases indigenous to Southeast Asia may explain the symptoms described in the refugee reports. The extraordinary combination of a war-torn country, years of death, disease, dislocation, and havoc are the backdrop for these accusations of chemical warfare. Because the events happened over 5 years ago, we may never completely know the answers. But the story of yellow rain has raised the larger issue of what role science can or should play in events of such international importance.
I think the role of science and of scientists has been critical. It was, after all, the key analytical and methodological breakthrough in 1981 with respect to physical samples that allowed us to put all the pieces of this puzzle together and reach our conclusion that such weapons were being used.
This was not a scientific experiment in a laboratory where we controlled all of the variables. And it could never be, because we're dealing with a hostile environment where we could not get in and collect samples. We had to collect those samples clandestinely or take what we could get from the refugees, etc. So that it was not a controlled scientific experiment that we were dealing with. And I think that within the bounds of the resources that we had to work with, we've made the best possible use of science.
I am not saying in any of this that any particular person has necessarily done bad science, but I can say something about the way in which the public can badly understand science, and it's this. Science does not consist of gathering lots and lots of evidence for one hypothesis. It consists of erecting at least two hypotheses and testing them one against the other. At each step, trying to find out if maybe your data is wrong or your hypothesis is wrong.
We will not allow the issue to be refocused on what we consider to be a tangential question, namely, is this or is it not a naturally occurring phenomenon? That is a thread, that is a hypothesis that warrants further investigation, and that's fine, and objective scientists should do that. But our responsibility, besides that, is in a different area, and that is to keep this case before the world public, to keep our conclusions before the world public, to deter and prevent any further use of these weapons.
In this particular case, the accusation that the Soviets have violated a biological weapons treaty could create an atmosphere in which properly inspected, properly verified agreements between us and the Soviets are impossible of achievement, either because of a poisoning of the negotiating atmosphere or because the United States Senate, which must, by a two-thirds vote, ratify all treaties, cannot produce a two-thirds vote simply because some number of senators, even a small one, might have been persuaded by these charges. I don't believe that the argument that you can't trust the Russians so you shouldn't have treaties with them has any merit at all, not because you can trust the Russians, but because treaties should never be based on trust. Treaties should be based, when needed, on verifiable provisions. But these allegations have muddied the waters and hang as a miasma over the negotiation process.
The story of the yellow rain and what has happened so far in terms of trying to prove that it was used or not has shown how ill-prepared the world was to handle such an issue. This was the first time ever that it was alleged that a substance that may occur naturally in the environment was used. How do you verify whether a naturally occurring substance was used as a weapon or not? That is a problem in itself, and I think we better learn from what we have done now and set up a procedural manual where we would go back to in the future and say these are the absolute minimum requirements of studies and of investigation that have to be done before anyone can step forward and say, I accuse such and such a nation of having used a compound illegally.
It may be impossible to ever solve the mystery of yellow rain. But this story has pointed out both the importance of scientific investigation and the difficulties of conducting science in a war zone. By reflecting on how the investigation was conducted and how the evidence was evaluated, we may be able to set a standard for the future. This is essential in a world where the science of warfare is so subtle that our methods of investigation must be as sophisticated in their response.
Tonight, KCET observes Holocaust Remembrance Week with a powerful documentary. Join us when the children of Holocaust survivors tell how they have been affected by their parents' experiences. Don't miss A Generation Apart tonight at 10. Now stay tuned for Frontline next.
For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Nova, Box 322, Boston, Massachusetts, 02134. Please be sure to include the show title. Major funding for Nova is provided by this station and other public television stations nationwide. Additional funding was provided by Allied Corporation, an advanced technology company proud to support outstanding science programming on public television. And the Johnson & Johnson family of companies, supplying healthcare products worldwide. A companion book, Nova, Adventures in Science, published by WGBH and the Addison Wesley Publishing Company, is available in libraries and bookstores nationwide.